name is Bill Cowie. I'm head of an organization called the Every Canadian Counts Coalition. A little bit about my background. I've been passed recently. I just left as the president of the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities, called OCAPD, which is the largest disability service organization in Ottawa. We look after about over 1,000 developmentally disabled adults, and some of you in Ottawa may know us for our garlic program out at Silver Spring Farm out there on Richmond Road and Baseline. I've been involved in the sector, I guess, more or less for 15 years. Some of it was because of a personal interest, some family issues with people in my family who had mental illness, that sort of thing. But I just found myself on the board of this organization and have sort of plunged in ever since. The presentation I'm about to give to you today has to do with both the history and the reason for the existence of something we call the Every Canadian Counts Coalition. And with that, I will now actually turn over to the presentation itself, if I may. I think we're going to switch gears here, and you'll lose my smiling face. There you go. Okay, here we go. All right. The Every Canadian Counts Coalition. We're an advocacy group, and plain and simple, advocating on a number of fronts, both in the public and with government, for the creation of a national disability insurance program to support more than the almost 2 million Canadians who have what are called chronic disabilities. And I say that word chronic because that's an important distinction to make. We're looking at people who have basically lifetime disabilities, either whether they were born with them or whether it fell upon them by accident or whatever. Oh yes, I control the slides. There we go. I'll start out by talking about some of the issues. I'll talk then about our beginnings, the proposal itself, the proposal itself, and then a little bit about the insurance model. I don't need to tell you the horror stories. I think you probably know some of them yourself. These are just some headlines that came out of a few years ago. Frantic parents search for housing for their autistic son. It's only because of my daughter that I'm still here. A woman battling terminal cancer, wondering what is going to happen to her child when she can no longer go on. Exhausted parents leaving children at government offices. Cases of murder, suicide, and more extreme cases where the parents are just absolutely in despair. The big issue right now, when we look at it, is what we would call the aging problem. For the first time in history, in the last 30 or 40 years, people with chronic disabilities are outliving their caregivers. And this is causing the caregivers great anxiety, great distress, because frankly, they don't know what's going to happen. And there is no mechanism in place right now to help them. It isn't difficult, let's put it that way. Okay, I'm pressing this button and it's not, there we go. Okay, I'm sorry, here we go. Yeah, oh, it's jumped on me, there we go. Okay, problems. What are the problems with the current system? These will be familiar to you. Long waiting lists, we've heard about the waiting lists, for often inadequate and inappropriate services. It's a system whereby it's not a case of what you need, it's a case of what you can get, right? Falling off the cliff during lifetime transitions. In other words, 21 years of age, you're out of the school system, you're entering the adult system, all of those supports you got when you were a child disappear and you have to start all over again. My brother-in-law, case in point, had a Down son in Oakville. He turned 21, he moved to BC because he could get better services for his son out there. But not everybody has that option. Inability to relocate and take supports with you, not just across provinces, but within provinces even. In the case of Quebec, for example, if you have a wheelchair supplied by Quebec and you move out of the province, you have to give it up. Limited provincial funding and resources, we know that issue only too well. The onerous bureaucracy associated with trying to get access to resources and services. Poor data and information, which is chronic. We really do not have any horizontal or cross-cutting data on interventions, what works, what doesn't, that is in any way systematic. We do not have a Canadian Institute of Health Information for the disabled sector, basically, that has been gathering this data. So part of the problem is when you start to advocate for it, you really are not sure of the numbers and what it is you need to be asking for. And the fragmentation within the sector is something we know all too well, and I'll move that on. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As for our beginnings, I was head, as I mentioned to you, of the Ottawa Carleton Association for Persons with Developmental Disabilities. And I left for a couple of years to come back to assume the role again. And I realized that it was the same conversation I was having when I first joined the board some 5 years earlier. And really what we were dealing with was a system that was stuck. The challenges were known, but the incremental changes that were going on were basically not working and not dealing with some of the fundamental problems that I've already talked about. The agenda created in the 1970s focused on deinstitutionalization, but it has remained unchanged and has stalled. Multiple agendas have ensued with horrendous fragmentation, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. Even significant sums sometimes injected into the system didn't do the job. Like Ontario government, for example, put another $8 billion into the system some 4 or 5 years ago, and it still didn't address the issues. We undertook some research, and we asked what was happening in some other provinces, and we came up with some results, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Now, basically, what we have here, when I talked about the fragmentation, you have across the top here a number of different disabilities: multiple sclerosis, blind, deaf, multiple muscular dystrophy, brain injury, developmental disabilities, autism, Down, and so on. Over here, you have what I would call the different agendas associated with people with disabilities, organizations working on different agendas. You have income, employment, access, housing, integration, education, transition. When I say transition, like 21 years old, organizations that work simply helping out on that transition. So there's what the landscape looks like. So you've got all of these different disability organizations across, or disability issues across the top. You've got all these different agendas on this column. And what you have is you have agencies working in one or more of those boxes, right? And they're all competing for resources. The other dimension of this, okay, didn't show up, I'll go back. The other dimension of this is what I would call, oh yes, down here, 70s now, what I would call the disability flavor of the month. In the 1970s, developmental disabilities was very much on the agenda with the deinstitutionalization agenda. In the 1980s, it was spinal cord injury with Rick Hansen, when that was featured. In the 1960s, it was the Downs, was very prominent and a focus. More recently, it has been autism, right? So we move around in terms of what we consider important, depending on the circumstances. One of the things I found very interesting is that all of a sudden this weekend are these full-page articles about FAST, fetal alcohol syndrome, which has been, everybody's known about, but all of a sudden it is seen as the disability issue. So now we've got a new one. And I think there's a reason for that, is because the Ontario government got beaten up on the autism defunding issue, and the FAST issue was something, you know, if you can't win in this one, you change the channel, right? And I mean, but this has gone on all the time, you know, so it just perpetuates the continuous competing for resources and for the agenda and for the public interest over different periods of time. Okay, the approach since deinstitutionalization in the 70s, what was it? Well, there were income measures taken, you know, some grants and that sort of thing. They were insufficient to actually address the need. Taxation issues, there are no, in fact, for people who are poor to begin with, getting a tax back when you don't have any income is really not much use to you. There's employment, but again, it's only for some, because some of the people in this sector can't work. There's accessibility, big on the agenda right now, but the problem is it actually doesn't address personal needs, right? It doesn't address the essential supports you need to function or improve your functionality, which is the kind of thing we're interested in. There's also housing as well as another. These are the kind of areas where efforts have been made, and what we're arguing is, for all those things, if you are going to provide a person with essential supports, you provide them with the wheelchair they need, you provide them with the prosthesis they need, you provide them with the psychological counseling they need, you supply them with the medication they need to help them reduce their nervous twitch or whatever, that kind of thing. If you provide the essential supports that people need to function to the fullest of their capability, then all of these other things become easier. Canada's system is under strain and increasingly failing. As I said, the aging population issue is one that is very much front and center with certainly the population we look after. The capacity of families to cope is decreasing, in part because of smaller families. There is not the situation like in my grandfather's day, you know, where there was 4 or 5 kids and one was always held back to look after somebody. You know, I have an aunt that was like that, and the aunt was left, my aunt was left basically to look after the parents. All that structure is gone. There's no family member to take up that anymore because there's only 1 or 2 children. The system is unsustainable in its current operating and financial environment. The system is costly, it's inefficient, and it doesn't serve people well. Okay, we looked abroad. We looked at some national programs. We looked at Germany, we looked at Denmark, we looked at Australia. Germany's fairly comprehensive. Interestingly enough, under their definitions, they would say that from the smallest of disabilities to the most severe form of disabilities, they estimate that 47% of the population probably has something, you know, and some require support, some don't. Denmark was another one we looked at, but Australia, which was which had the most interesting program, was the one we finally settled on and saying, I think we have something going on here in Australia that we want to see. Now, I mentioned I was on the board of Vocapity. I had a member of the board whose wife was Australian. He was a World Bank economist, and he had spent time in Australia. And he also told us about what was going on in Australia. So that was also very helpful to us. We looked at something called the National Disability Insurance, what they call the National Disability Insurance Scheme now, was originally called the program. And there was an organization there called the Every Australian Counts Coalition. And basically that's our sister organization in Australia. The Australians came to the conclusion that the disability support system in Australia was basically a lottery. And even the Ombudsman for Ontario said that the people who get, so it's a lottery for the people who get disability supports in Ontario. You either get lucky or you don't, and it has nothing to do with need, and it has nothing to do with any kind of rational approach to providing support services. And the other thing he said, as the Ombudsman for Ontario, who knows how the bureaucracy works, I found it difficult working my way through that system. Anyway, Every Australian Counts. It was a coalition of individuals, caregivers, and support agencies that proposed a national insurance program to cover those living with chronic and severe disabilities. And it gained unanimous support among the Australian population. They actually did a referendum on it. In fact, the minister in charge, he was terrified when this was going on. I said, oh, they'll never agree to this. They'll never agree to this. They sent out a referendum, and they basically said, and they had numbers associated with it, and I'll talk about those numbers in a minute. At this cost, are you prepared to support a national disability insurance program that would provide people with chronic disabilities with the essential supports that they need throughout their lifetime? The answer came back, 87 to 90% of them said yes. It was not a hard sell. Now, part of that is Australia. They're very together on these kinds of issues, and they're very much more cohesive. They weren't nearly as fragmented as our jurisdiction is here, as our structure is here, so they could mobilize the discussion much more easily. But nevertheless, the idea was extremely sellable. Now, we think the time is right. We've talked to Canadian politicians, and they, you know, about a national approach, but they said that unity is going to be required if anything is to happen. Now, that's also a good excuse, because until the unity happens, they don't have to do anything, right? And they can continue to play the one off against the other. But the stakeholders are eager for change. People know that, you know, they're exhausted from fighting for decades, many of them. The Canadian public, generally speaking, is receptive, and the government, I have to say, is listening and is active in the area. And the federal government, in particular, is now stepping up to the plate again after disappearing from the agenda largely for about the last 25 years, following there was a report called the Obstacles Report produced by the Canadian Senate in 1981, where the federal government looked like it was going to get really involved in disability issues. And then it all disappeared under budget pressures and then changes in government and so on and so forth. The feds are getting back into it now with the Accessibility Act. That's just the leading edge of all this sort of thing. What is Every Canadian Counts? We're a non-for-profit organization. We're advocating for the creation of a national disability insurance program for long-term chronic disabilities. It includes individuals living with disabilities and their families, some of our board members, organizations, agencies, and groups. We have a large number of organizations that have endorsed and supported us, and it's made up of concerned citizens as well. Our proposal, a national publicly funded disability insurance program that will cover all Canadians living with long-term disabilities throughout their lifetime, cradle to grave. It will provide essential supports and services. I want to emphasize that this is not an income program. It's a supports program, and it is not means tested. It would not be. We would not like it to be means tested. It's a matter of entitlement, which is what the Australians do, by the way. It ensures portability and minimum standards across Canada. So if you have it in one place, you can get it in another. It's a Medicare model, right? Improved data collection and sharing of best practices in the disability sector would be one of its features. One of the things about the Australian National Disability Insurance Scheme is the data collection is just unbelievable. It's monumental, it's high quality, and it's made an enormous difference to the efficiency of the system in actually having the numbers on what works, what doesn't, you know, where is the most effective in economical expenditures, all that sort of stuff, and what sort of treatment options actually work. And our objective is this is a federal program. We want the federal government to step up and do this. Now, one of the interesting things about Australia was that we were attracted to was the fact that jurisdictionally it was just exactly like Canada. The states in Australia were responsible for disability support services. The federal government was almost nowhere to be seen. This is the same in Canada. It's all provincial. But all provinces are having the same difficulties that I mentioned at the beginning. Underfunding, inadequate or insufficient, you know, supports, all that sort of stuff. And the provinces, frankly, are tapped out. Provinces, as you know, are not spending more these days. It looks like they're going to spend less, actually. So we're turning our eyes on the federal government. The Australians turned their eyes on the federal government, and the federal government stepped up to the plate. There was no real constitutional issues because social services was never really defined in the Constitution as to jurisdictional issues, but it was, so it's not a big area of contention. The public insurance model is a lifetime approach to care and support. And it's designed to replace all these little specialty disability services that people have to chase after. In the tradition of Medicare, universal health care, you assess the risk of the disability in the general population, you calculate the costs of meeting the essential lifetime needs, and then you estimate what the premium would be for everyone. Everyone pays into it. And anyone who needs it benefits from it. So it's a universal program. And that's what we're asking for. Instead of cap programs and services, which people need to find and access, you fund it on the basis of needs and drive and needs to drive the nature of care and the nature of support. And when I say what it is they look for, it's a need. When I say needs, the needs are assessed on the basis of what is it you need to help you function and to engage to the fullest capability that is possible for you. Okay, so it might have to be a translator because you have trouble, or voice recognition or something that enable you to speak. It might be, as I say, a prosthesis. I'll give you an example of the kind of nonsense that goes on in this sector. Rick Mercer had a really interesting piece where he went down to something called the Maple Leaf Health Clinic in Toronto, where he met this wonderful woman, he said, who had saved up for years to get this prosthetic leg. Okay, so she'd gone for years basically without it. But he said, oh, and look at all this wonderful technology, and look at it, she managed to save up and get this prosthetic leg. And so on. I said, so I called up Maple Leaf Services. I said, you know, if we had a disability insurance program, she would have been able to get one right away. Oh, he said, but that's only half the story, he said. The prosthetic leg we gave her was technology that was 50 years old because that's all she could afford. Okay? So that's and see, this stuff doesn't get talked about, right? It's all invisible. I have a family friend, a surgeon in Brampton, prominent surgeon in Brampton. When I told him I was working on this, he said, oh, I thought these people were looked after from a doctor. So, you know, part of our job is to get the public discussion going about the situation that people are actually living. And that was actually the key to the success of Australia. They didn't go out and say, we wanted this insurance program. What they did was they told the stories. They had ads about, did you know that in Australia, it costs you this amount of money to buy a wheelchair? And what if you are not working? You know, ads like that went all over the place. Or they would have, you know, stories in the papers about families under strain, breakups of marriages, all that sort of stuff. And that's what got the Australians. They didn't even make it a rights issue. They talked about it extensively before they went to the referendum. And what the Australians came to the conclusion of, well, this is just the right thing to do. And it's the right thing for government to do. Okay. Funding on the basis of needs. As I say, funded from the general tax revenue, and it's been implemented over the last 10 years. Australia rolled out the full program last year. And I think they were adding something like 10 or 20,000 persons per month to the program. They estimated they would be supporting somewhere in the order of 420,000 people, you know, within the first 2 years of the program. Implementation is a huge issue. People who would be eligible, people with a severe or profound disability, those who always or sometimes need help with a core activity or test would be eligible for life. Carers would also be recognized and supported in their roles. That's an important function of that disability insurance, is it also helps out the carers. The opportunities to combine caring and work would be encouraged. Oh, important point here. They did a study of, okay, how much is this going to cost and who does it benefit? They looked at it and they said, okay, you know, you're talking about a population of people with disabilities. So there's your universe. Here's the disabilities. We've categorized them they categorize them into 21 different grades of disability in terms of severity and how much it would cost for each of them. Gave the total, divided it by the revenue they would need every year to maintain this system, and the tax bill was $370 a year on average for every taxpayer in Australia. That's the average. So some would pay more, some would, you know, some rather would pay more, and some would pay less. So you're talking $370 for a disability insurance program. You can spend that in 5 minutes. So it wasn't. The other thing they found out was it was actually going to be a boost to the economy, because the big thing it would do, it would free up women to go back to work. And that's what's happened. by the way. Not only that, the National Disability Insurance Program in Australia, or scheme in Australia, was the largest new single employer in Australia last year. Okay. Carers would be recognized, as I say, and people covered by province, territory-based accident compensation schemes would continue to be covered. No one would lose benefits if they already had some. Coordinated services based on need. Other support funded outside the scheme, such as income support, housing, and employment services, would be integrated into a holistic approach to support services. The emphasis was on early intervention. The insight into early intervention in autism came from the NDIS in Australia, because they were the first ones to actually gather statistics on what worked and what didn't. And the idea is, you know, to access education and training to maximize long-term independence and potential. That's the whole point of it. I could go on, I could talk about the principles and so on if you want me to, but yeah, I think you get the idea of what it is we're advocating for here. I think probably there's an intuitive understanding of just what this would try to address. What every Australian Counts Coalition does right now that has been implemented is it's maintained its status as an independent organization, no government funding, to monitor and ensure that the disability insurance program is adhering to the principles that they wanted to see in that program. And I'll just move on to that for a second. Okay. I'll just go here. They had something in Australia called the 10 non-negotiables when they first designed this program. First, designed to fill the disability support gaps in Australia's safety net. It aims to remove barriers to the full social, economic, and cultural participation of individuals living with disabilities and families. It addresses the barriers issue, but it does it from a needs perspective. Reframed disability support as an economically responsible investment rather than charity. This is important. The language you use around this is important. This is not considered charity. It's not considered social welfare. It's an insurance program. People pay into it. And it's designed to be an investment in improving people's skills and capability to engage in society. It's in Australia, they call it the opportunities agenda. It's not even, you know, so it, you know, that kind of thing is important. It focuses on early intervention, as I said, and believes in sustained supports. And if support needs change, it changes with you. If you need a personal care worker, you get one. Relieves families of unpaid care work, as I mentioned before, and of being primarily responsible. It takes a huge burden off of families. We have some politicians who believe that this is the ultimate family responsibility. I mean, you know, which is, you know, which is move. Anyway, okay. The other ones were, it was a person-centered funding. It's based on individual need. So it's a form of individualized funding, if you like. Covers cost of regular care, support, therapy, equipment, residential needs, training, personal care, life skills, employment, all that sort of, or employability rather. Provides choice to families. They can decide how they want to do it. They can either have the money transferred to them personally, which they then manage, or they can go through agencies or whatever. Offers equitable levels of support to individuals across the spectrum. And it was available to all Australians. The man who led the charge was a man named Bill Shorten, who's now head of the Labour Party and is probably going to be the next Prime Minister. Okay, I can leave it there. Any questions?
I'll just say I found your.
Excuse me, just because I'm recording this.
Oh yes.
That's fine. So you.
I'll sit down.
Yeah, and basically you ask the question, and Bill will just read.
Oh, you can either come to the speaker or I can repeat.
Oh, no, it's better now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll repeat your question.
Yeah. And
first, I found your speech very humbling, just saying how bad the situation was. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what the idea is behind a province. If you go from province A to province B and I'm on a wheelchair, and then all of a sudden I have to go back to the hospital, return my chair, and go to a new province and get a new chair. What is the dynamics? What's the idea behind it? It sounds so inefficient.
Well, there's no mutual agreement among the provinces to share resources for this sector. I mean, these things have to be set up with interprovincial agreements. And there is no interprovincial discussion going on anywhere at any level. There used to be, but there isn't anymore now. There's no interprovincial coordinating committee on disabilities in this country.
The second question
I just want to repeat, I was asked why, why, you know, a person moving from province to province would have to give up a wheelchair. But you know, what is determining that? And I'm just saying that there's been no mutual agreements like they have between transfer on Medicare. The provinces had to negotiate Medicare transfer agreements and all that sort of stuff. And there isn't anything for this sector.
Okay, the second question I had, I just making two questions in a row. You mentioned that the patients are outliving their caregivers. Does that mean that I'm disabled and my parents are taking care of me, but because of our health care, I'm living longer?
Yeah.
I'm outliving them, and
yeah.
Now I'm on my own?
Basically, Medicare and the interventions we have allowed people with chronic disabilities to live longer. And as I say, for the first time in history, outlived the caregivers. And I mean, I have a sister-in-law who has a Down son, and it was fairly common for Down's children to die, you know, latest to the early 30s. Well, not this kid. And his dad has already died, and mom's left alone. So yeah, I mean, but this is a tidal wave that's coming. I mean, that's the thing. Just yes.
I'm wondering, where does your funding come from?
ECCs?
Yes.
We don't have any.
Okay. Well, that's the point I'm trying to make. Is there must be a mechanism for donation, or there must?
Oh yes, there is.
Okay.
And I'm being a little bit over dramatic. Okay. Initially, the question was asked, where does every Canadian Counts get its funding? And basically, we got our funding initially from an organization called the Ontario Association Supporting Individuals with Special Needs. And OASIS, it's called, and it's an umbrella organization in Ontario for the developmental disability sector. We got it in year's funding. We went back to the next year to get a second round funding, and we experienced the blowback of the vested interests because we were stepping up as a national organizations, and there were some national organizations that were not happy, to be perfectly honest with you. And they happened to be on the board of that organization and managed to sort of, you know, not renew our funding. So we got another round of funding, in fact, from the agency that I was head of, which counts out some money. We've also had some individual donations from some other organizations and so on and so forth. And I'm not a fundraiser. I'm not a very good fundraiser. I was my strategy was if organizations and so on feel they want to support it, you know, we'll do it by osmosis. You know, they'll step up. But the big problem was Revenue Canada and charities and advocacy. And charities could not be seen to be supporting advocacy groups, or they could lose their charitable status. So there was, and combined with the fact that many of an organization would normally step up to support us had themselves been suffering from very, very severe limits on their own funding, that it was a very, very difficult environment to raise funds, in fact. But we've had lots of in-kind support. Our brochures have been printed by one agency. Our report was translated in French by Independent Living Canada. Cup W has stepped up with some help. We've talked to a number of unions, by the way. Building trades are very interested in what we're doing. NUPKI was a supporter of ours at the beginning as well. I've talked to who else? Anyway, they're escaping me right now. But there's been 3 or 4 union organizations that we have been in close contact with. I've also talked to the CLC, but the CLC has had a traditional relationship with the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and was kind of reluctant, you know, didn't feel it could throw its weight behind us simply because that relationship now exists. And I don't have a problem with that. I can certainly see that. And we're not out to displace anybody or to knock anybody off the table or anything like that. We just want everybody to support us around this singular idea. We want everybody to support this idea, however they can. But the other thing we need is we need champions. We need basically people to be out there talking about it, talking it up, saying this is something this country needs.
So that would be my second question, is what is the coalition's approach in Canada to raise awareness and gain support?
Yeah, in terms of raising awareness,
you have to repeat.
Yes, in terms of raising awareness and gaining support for this idea in Canada, we have been quite successful in getting the message out to the major disability organizations in Canada. They know about this idea. We've been told that we have changed the conversation. And we have also been working very politically through the policy processes of the various political parties, and we've been in contact with the political parties. I've been told to wait to see what the platforms are like in the upcoming election. There might be something on that. In terms of engagement with the Canadian public, that has yet to happen. I know there is a current resolution before the Liberal Party of Canada, which I gather made its way up the chain, whether this becomes reality or not, but it's to embark on a research program to look at the feasibility, desirability, and viability of a national disability insurance program. And that could be the framework for a national discussion. The suggestion being made to me, it might be something like a special advisor being appointed to look at this sort of thing. But you've also raised another interesting point. The Australians did the research. The Productivity Commission of the Government of Australia wrote a 950-page report, quantitative and qualitative data on the feasibility of and the costs of this program. They did their estimates in 2010. They wrote out the program. They reevaluated it a year and a half ago, and they were bang on in their numbers. It was a model of government doing things right. But we need that kind of groundwork to be done first, I think. But as I say, it's important to get the discussion out there for the Canadian public. Part of the problem when we started 4 years ago was the world of possibilities had been broken. Nobody had any hope really that the system was going to change in any way, shape, or form. They were all fighting for what little they could get. And when you think about what Australia did in 2010, at the height of the neoliberal revolution, when the free market was all, they put together and created a government-funded social program that was, in financial terms, the equivalent of the pension plan. $23 billion program at the height of pre-market thinking. And you sort of sit there and say, how the heck did you do that? Well, you hit the right issue and you put it in the right terms and people say, yeah, you know? Yeah. So, pretty exciting, eh? No, it is. This is what David Lewis, bless his heart. I met David Lewis when I was a very young teenager and very politically active. This is what he would call the good fight. This is the kind of fight you want to be in.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yes, I do. So, are you working on a plan to engage Canadians? Is that what you said?
Well, yeah, I mean, we put in a funding proposal. The question was, are we working for, have a plan to engage Canadians? Yes, we actually have a project plan. It was a project plan I submitted to the government 3 years ago when the new disability secretariat was being created under Carla Qualtrough, and the feds were getting back into the game, and they were looking to re-engage disability organizations in Canada, largely around the Accessibility Act, which was driving this. And we put in a project proposal at that time, which was $1.3 million for a public engagement project. We called it the Every Canadian Counts project. And that project was $1.3 million to go basically across the country bring in all the disability organizations into meetings, present them with the idea, have roundtables about the discussion about what they thought about it, get the feedback and get back to them all across the country. That's the way, that was the plan. What the difference is, we do not have in Canada what the Australians had. The Australians had 3 large national organizations, one for persons with disabilities, one for agencies and caregivers, agencies and organizations rather, and another one for caregivers. And they were national organizations and very good. And so they could talk to each other and they came up with those 10 non-negotiable principles because they could talk to each other. But the other thing they did was they each came up with $350,000 each for 3 years for the Every Australian Counts Coalition to do their public engagement work. But we don't have anything like that here. Yes.
This is going to be a type of insurance. So what's the age range? Who's it going to cover?
Birth to death.
Birth to death.
Yeah. Cradle to grave. Yeah. If you're born with a disability, you're automatically in the program.
And people that later on develop disability.
They'll be in the program if it's a chronic disability. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you don't get different services depending on where you live. And you don't get different services because somebody did a different assessment from somebody else, or they have different criteria for assessments like we have all over the country right now. We don't even have the same standards of assessment.
Just this is more of an observation. I found this was very, very similar to that movie that Michael Moore did, talking about the healthcare system in the United States and compared it all around, and you're just kind of like, wow, you know, if you had a man who lost a thumb and a finger, and you only had enough insurance to choose one, and
Yeah.
he had to make that choice, and this is what it's looking like, you know, it's like.
Oh yeah. Oh well, that is what it looks like. The question was about this. It reminds somebody of the Michael Moore movie about the U.S. healthcare system and about how somebody had to go in, and his insurance only covered one when he had two severed fingers, or a finger and a thumb, and the insurance only covered one finger, and so or one thumb, but wouldn't cover both. That sort of thing. It's very much like that. In fact, psychologically, the National Disability Insurance Scheme was introduced, the psychological effect on the caregivers was interesting because they were so used to being told what they could get that when they were asked what it is they need, they actually had to think about that because it had never been put to them in those terms before. Yeah, so it's a socially transformational program, and the Australians are extremely proud of it. But they still have to fight. I mean, it's governments are governments, and they're always. And unfortunately, the government that introduced it was a Labour government, and the government that came in after was a Conservative government. And of course, they immediately put their stamp on it, and they replaced the head of it with a banker. This sort of stuff. So every Australian Counts has had its work to do to make sure that the ship stays steady.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the engaging Canadians.
Okay.
Because even the way you described it, you're going to go to all the organizations, right? But we have to get the buy-in of all the Canadians. That
Absolutely.
Piece, right?
You're absolutely right.
And the unity piece in our country, as you said, is somewhat lacking,
Mm-hmm.
right? Canadians and Australians are a lot alike. Yeah, the countries are kind of similar in demographically, maybe,
Yeah.
right? But in terms of political viewpoints, I think they're a little bit different, a lot different from what you're describing. Because in Canada, we hear, I know someone who has a child with Down syndrome, and the kid was noisy in a mall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody came up to her and said, why did you even have this kid?
Oh yes.
And this happens regularly.
Oh, it does.
To this person. It's not, to us it sounds horrible, but this is what they say, right? So to get a person like that to say you have to pay $300 a year, right? So that certain people, just for them to get around it, is a difficult task.
Well,
individually.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't, we have to begin there too.
Mm-hmm.
Doing organizations is fine, But individual Canadians who have no stakes in the game have to be made to have stakes in the game,
Oh, quite agree.
right? So it's just, again, that's just an observation.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. I'll try to summarize your question. Basically, the question was posed to me is how do you engage basically the average Canadian citizen in this discussion in a positive and meaningful way when you get reactions from the Canadian public like, you know, why did you have a child like that? Or in the case, and I'll add to your story a little bit here. Just the other day, head of Deafblind Services Ontario was out opening up her new residence in bars, actually, beautiful building, so on and so forth, where all the neighbors were protesting, right? Because this home for people with disabilities was being built. And this is not uncommon, but basically how do we get to the Canadian, the question is how do we get Canadians rather than organizations involved in this? Is that a fair representation?
And organizations, it's not a.
And organizations, okay.
It's not an either or, it's more like everybody together.
Absolutely. In answering that, there's two things I will observe is Canada is a very heavily brokered society in the sense that to get at people, you often have to run through an organization of some kind or another. A very famous quote from Pierre Trudeau about, you know, when you really want to get something done, you go over the heads of the vested interests and you talk directly to the Canadian people. It's very hard. You try to get the list of the members of organizations, like the parents of organizations with associations, like no way can you get those lists, you know? But the kinds of things that we were talking about going out across the country, the whole point was to make sure that the parents and the caregivers and the families were in on those discussions, but also to make the point that there isn't probably a person anywhere that doesn't have a family member or doesn't know someone with a disability when they really think about it. And the fact that, look, you can become disabled tomorrow, just get into a car accident, right? And this is the conversation that we need to have with people. Absolutely. And that's the conversation, the kind of conversation we want to have. And that's what the Australians were so very good at.
But how can we do that without funding, without
Well,
the government?
There's the point.
behind you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I say, if the research agenda comes first, that may start to open the doors. But it takes organizations with some pockets to say, this is something we want to see. So,
Anything else?
thank you, by the way.
So we have one last question.
Sure, one last question.
Just, we're one committee
Uh-huh.
in an organization. What can we do to support your efforts?
Well, you can go on our website and sign up as supporters. You can get organizations to endorse us and or at least endorse the idea. Just say, you know, we heard of this very interesting idea. Get in touch with your MPs. You know, get in touch with families of persons with disabilities and let them know about it and get them to sort of at least be aware of it and so on. Start to cultivate the ground in any way. Use your, like, you know, link up. We send out postings on social media. You can take those postings and send them out to your network. You can, you know, have them go to our web page, and I have there's a video presentation of this that is on the web. They can look at that. And, you know, encourage small donations, of course, for us. All help, even big ones help. And you know, because we had a staff member, but because of the lack of funding, we lost her. She was brilliant, by the way. You know, we had a very good social media presence. We had 5,000 people on Facebook at one point, and that sort of thing. But we've had that's all gone by because we just haven't had the dedicated resources. So there's many in the brochure. Actually, it talks about the ways you can help in the back, and I think it's on the back.
Yeah.
You know, again, the brochures. I got a ton of brochures. You can send those out to people. That sort of thing. Sure. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the question. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. There we go. Now you're continuing on the business side? No?
Yeah, just, well, thank